It is the morning of April 5th, 1968, in Riceville, Iowa, a small town of fewer than 1,000 people. A third-grade teacher named Jane Elliott is driving to school. The radio is on. The news is still processing what happened yesterday. Martin Luther King Jr. is dead, shot on the balcony of a Memphis motel at 6:01 in the evening. The civil rights movement's most recognized voice, silenced. The country is reeling. Jane Elliott is 34 years old, white, and teaching in a town so homogeneous that her students have likely never met a black person. She has been trying to find a way to teach them about discrimination, to make it real for children who have no direct experience of it, who live in a world where the word prejudice is abstract, distant, someone else's problem. She walks into her classroom, looks at 23 8-year-old faces, and makes a decision that will define the rest of her life. She is going to show them exactly what discrimination feels like. Not through a book, not through a film, through their own skin. Welcome back to The Darkest Experiments. Last time, we watched 22 boys at a summer camp develop genuine hatred for children they had never met, hatred engineered through nothing more than group separation and competition. We saw how quickly the tribal instinct activates and how a shared challenge can begin to dissolve the walls it builds. Today, we stay with the theme of prejudice, but we move it from a remote state park into a primary school classroom. And this time, the person running the experiment is not a university researcher. She is a teacher. Her subjects are not carefully screened college students. They are 8 years old, and the lesson she is about to deliver is one that her students will carry with them for the rest of their lives. Jane Elliott had been thinking about how to teach race and discrimination for some time before that April morning. She had used a Sioux legend about the brotherhood of mankind as a classroom exercise, but it had not produced the response she hoped for. Children would nod, agree, express the right sentiments, and then go back to a world in which those sentiments were never tested. Understanding, she had come to believe, is not the same as knowing. You can understand that something is painful without knowing what that pain feels like. And for children who had never been targets of discrimination, who had never been told that something essential about them made them inferior, the concept was genuinely, experientially hollow. King's assassination was the catalyst that moved her from consideration to action. She would later say that she could not stand in front of her students that morning and tell them that a great man had been killed because of the color of his skin, and then go on with the ordinary day. Something had to be different. Something had to be real. Elliott stood before her class and told them that she had learned something important, that scientists had discovered that people with brown eyes were more intelligent, more civilized, and more hardworking than people with blue eyes. Brown-eyed people, she explained, were simply better. She gave the brown-eyed children extra privileges. They got 5 extra minutes at recess. They got second helpings at lunch. They were allowed to use the drinking fountain. They were encouraged to play with each other and not with the blue-eyed children, who could not be trusted to behave as well. The blue-eyed children were given paper collars to wear around their necks, visible, physical markers of their inferior status, visible from across the room and across the playground. What happened next was not gradual. It was almost immediate. The brown-eyed children transformed. Within hours, children who had been kind, easygoing, and friendly toward their blue-eyed classmates became dismissive, condescending, and openly cruel. They enforced the rules Elliott had established with an enthusiasm she had not asked for. They reported blue-eyed children for minor infractions. They made cutting remarks about their intelligence, their appearance, their behavior. Children who had been close friends the previous day stopped playing together, not because Elliott had told them to, but because the brown-eyed children had absorbed the logic of the hierarchy and were enacting it. The blue-eyed children collapsed inward. They became hesitant, quiet, self-conscious. Children who had been confident and talkative at the start of the school day were stumbling over their words by lunchtime. Their performance on academic tasks, spelling tests, reading exercises, deteriorated measurably within the single school day. One child who had shown no particular difficulty with reading was suddenly making errors he had not made in weeks. The collar, Elliott later reflected, was the detail that cut deepest. Not because of what it meant, but because of what it did. The moment a child reached up to touch it, or tried to hide it, or hunched their shoulders to make it less visible, something was happening in that child that had nothing to do with intellect and everything to do with dignity. On the second day, Elliott reversed the hierarchy. She told the class she had made a mistake. The information had been wrong. It was actually blue-eyed people who were superior, smarter, more trustworthy, more capable. The collars came off the blue-eyed children and were placed around the necks of the brown-eyed ones. What she expected was that the blue-eyed children, having lived through the inferior role the previous day, would treat their newly demoted classmates with more compassion, with the memory of how it felt still fresh. What she got was more complicated. The blue-eyed children did become the dominant group. They did absorb the privileges with enthusiasm, but the cruelty was somewhat muted compared to the previous day, and Elliott attributed this to the experience they carried. They had been in the collar. They knew from the inside what it produced. That knowledge did not make them perfectly kind, but it introduced a hesitation, a flicker of recognition, that tempered the worst of the behavior. The brown-eyed children, now in the subordinate role, moved through the same deterioration the blue-eyed children had experienced the day before. The academic performance dropped. The confidence evaporated. The collar worked its quiet damage regardless of who was wearing it. At the end of the second day, Elliott brought the class together and told them the truth. There was no scientific finding about eye color. Intelligence and character have nothing to do with how much melanin is in your iris. The entire exercise had been a demonstration. The room filled with tears. Children held each other. Brown-eyed and blue-eyed children who had spent 2 days separated by an artificial hierarchy reached across it with the urgency of people who had almost lost something. Elliott asked her students what they had learned. Their answers, captured in letters they wrote that day and in interviews conducted years and decades later, were not the rote sentiments of children reciting what the teacher wanted to hear. They were the words of children who had learned something in their bodies, not just their minds. One student wrote, "I felt like I was a dog on a leash." Another, "I felt dirty, like something was wrong with me that I couldn't fix." And from a brown-eyed child on the second day, "Now I know how it feels. I don't want to feel like that again. I don't want anyone to feel like that." That sentence, that movement from personal experience to empathy, was precisely what Jane Elliott had set out to produce. Elliott's exercise did not go uncontested. Parents in Riceville were not universally supportive. Some were angry that their children had been subjected to deliberate distress without their knowledge or consent. Some objected to the exercise on the grounds that white children should not be made to feel guilty or ashamed for the color of their eyes. The broader academic community raised questions about the ethics of causing measurable psychological distress in 8-year-old children, about the academic performance drops, about the visible emotional harm of the collar days, about the absence of formal consent from either parents or the children themselves. Elliott's counter-argument was characteristically direct. Every child of color in America experiences exactly this every single day of their lives. The only difference is that for white children, it lasted 2 days. And the discomfort lasted 2 days precisely because Elliott reversed it, explained it, and gave the children a framework for what they had experienced. Children living under actual discrimination get no such reversal, no explanation, no collar that comes off at the end of the lesson. Whether her argument fully resolves the ethical question is something each person must decide for themselves. What is not in question is that the children who went through that 2-day exercise remembered it for the rest of their lives, and that the lessons it produced in them were not abstract. The blue eyes, brown eyes exercise reveals something that the Robbers Cave experiment had already hinted at, but that Elliott's classroom made visceral and undeniable. Prejudice does not require hatred. It does not require history. It does not even require belief. It requires only a label, applied with authority, in a context where the hierarchy it creates is enforced. The brown-eyed children on day 1 did not secretly believe blue-eyed people were inferior before Elliott told them they were. But the moment the hierarchy was established and given institutional legitimacy, their behavior changed to reflect it. The label created the reality it described, and the lesson that cuts deepest, the one that has made Elliott one of the most sought-after diversity trainers in the world for over 50 years, is this: empathy is not built through information. It is built through experience. You can tell someone that discrimination hurts. You can show them statistics, share testimony, present evidence, and they will nod, agree, and return to their ordinary life, essentially unchanged. Or you can give them a collar and 2 days inside a hierarchy they did not choose and cannot escape, and something different happens, something that does not wash off. Jane Elliott walked into her classroom on April 5, 1968, the morning after Martin Luther King Jr. was killed, and she decided that grief without action was not enough. What she created in the next 2 days was imperfect, controversial, and in some respects ethically questionable. It was also one of the most powerful educational demonstrations ever conducted in a primary school classroom. Her students grew up. They became parents, teachers, professionals, citizens, and decades later, when researchers tracked them down and asked what they remembered from 3rd grade, they did not remember the spelling tests, or the math worksheets, or the field trips. They remembered 2 days in April when a collar taught them something that no book could have. Next time, we close Chapter 4 with the story that began with a murder on a New York street. A murder witnessed by dozens of people, not one of whom called for help. John Darley and Bibb Lataine turned that tragedy into one of the most replicated findings in social psychology. It is the bystander effect, and it will make you think very differently the next time you find yourself in a crowd. Subscribe so you're there for it. Leave a comment. Did Elliott's exercise change the way you think about empathy and how it is built? I want to hear your thoughts. I'll see you in the next one.